Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this morning. My name is Gus Charteris. I'm an independent consultant who's been working with the Waka Ekanoa Program Office. So the purpose of this webinar this morning is to step you through the proposed Waka Ekanoa pricing options as outlined in the consultation document, and that is available on the website. So after the session, we'll provide a link to that. You probably have seen that, but also a link to a feedback form, and we'd welcome your feedback on that. So I'm going to introduce the panelists this morning and then just run through how we're going to take questions and answers. So Kelly Forster, the Program Director for Waka Ekanoa, will provide a brief overview of the program and then some more detail on the pricing options. Erica van Reenen, who's a Director at Ag First, will outline the sequestration aspects of the proposals. And then we'll have Andrew Curtis, who will focus on, we'll step through the user journey for each of the options, or the user journey for farmers or collectives for each of the options. What we'll do, the aim is to finish the presentations by 11 o'clock to allow us half an hour for any questions. So that we've got a reasonable flow through the webinar. What we'd ask you to do is please ask your questions in the Q&A area of the webinar. You'll have an opportunity to have a look at those, monitor those, and if someone's asked a question that you particularly like, please upvote that, and that will just give us a sense of the most important questions which we can respond to at the end of the webinar. So we will be recording this presentation and we will make the video and presentation slides available on the website following the webinar. One person I haven't introduced is also Kate Thompson, who's part of the program office, and she'll be helping with the functionality of the webinar. So I think with that, unless please yell team if I've missed anything, I'll pass over to you, Kelly.
That's good, thanks Gus. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. I am Kelly Forster, the Program Director for Waka Ekanoa. And as Gus said, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of the pricing options. Before I do that, I'll just do a whistle-stop overview of the program in general. And then I'll hand on to Erica on sequestration and Andrew on more of the reporting details. So the concept of Waka Ekanoa as a partnership was pitched by the industry to government as an alternative to pricing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions via the ETS at the processor level. There are 13 partners, and you'll see all the logos there. So the key ag industry bodies, including the Federation of Māori Authorities, and 2 government agencies, the Ministry for Primary Industries and the Ministry for the Environment. I just also want to importantly note that we are supported in kind by our CRIs, Ag Research and others, and we've also had considerable involvement from the Greenhouse Gas Research Centres. The program has an overarching mission, which is to implement a framework, and that word implement is important, to get past the dialogue into delivery, that will reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and build the sector's resilience to climate change. There are 3 key parts to this mission for farmers and growers. That is to empower farmers and growers to measure, manage and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, to maintain, increase integrated sequestration on farms, and that word integrated is an important one as well, and adapt to a changing climate. And this is all in the context of, not at the expense of, a sustainable and competitive food and fibre sector. In addition to collaboratively designing an alternative pricing system to the emissions trading scheme, which will be the focus of this presentation, the program had some milestones around farm planning and emissions reporting. These milestones acknowledge the fact that you can't manage what you don't measure, and knowing that in any behaviour change framework, farmers will need to know what their emissions numbers are know what's driving those numbers, and know what the levers are that they can pull to change them, and then through the pricing mechanism have an incentive to act, as well as wraparound support. So that has all been built into these milestones. Just briefly on the milestones, we released our greenhouse gas guidance for farm plans at the start of last year. We have updated that, and we'll be releasing an update that has more around adaptation and more around freshwater integration, and you'll see that come out in March. We had a milestone of 25% of farms with greenhouse gas and farm plans by the start of this year. We are currently collating the reports on that progress. At last count, we were looking just under the 25%. COVID has disrupted quite a few of the farm plan rollouts. Farm planning is something that does need face-to-face support to deliver. So shifting to online hasn't necessarily been an option there. Then we also have getting input from partners on plans to meet that 100% milestone by the end of 2025. Those details will also be contained in a report that will be made public in March. On the emissions reporting side of the milestones, we had a milestone to achieve 25% of farms knowing their greenhouse gas numbers by the end of last year. At last count, and again, we're still compiling the final results, but at last count, we were tracking well above that, towards 60% of farms knowing their greenhouse gas numbers. So that's a significant amount of effort from the partners in terms of delivery, and there's been both their use of existing calculators, Overseer FarmX and the like, but also the development of new calculators such as the beef and lamb greenhouse gas calculator. Again, in March, we'll release details around the plans partners have to get to that 100% milestone, so push past the 60% towards the 100%. That last bullet point there relates to the setup of the emissions pricing system, and that's what I'll talk about now. So Waka Kanoa is recommending an alternative system to pricing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions via the NZETS at the processor level. In terms of the timeline for this, as you're aware, we're currently undertaking nationwide engagement. What preceded this was some targeted engagement in November, December with kind of key farmer council groups and the like. That was an opportunity to test and refine options before undertaking this nationwide engagement. We have received an extension to our recommendations report being due, which is now due in May 2022. And that's in response to COVID red settings and just the general disruption that this new variant will cause over this month. So it still enables us, so it will enable us to have more effective engagement with farmers over a longer period. And teams are really carefully managing that balance between the importance of face-to-face engagement for this issue, but obviously balancing maintaining the health of farmers and the teams that are out there talking about the options. But also you'll see in that bottom line there, there are implications for our timelines if they go past May. So the key one there, between May and December, once we make our recommendations, they are to ministers. Ministers then need to, Cabinet then needs to decide what they're going to do in response to our recommendations. As part of that, they would do a typical government legislative process, which will involve wide consultation, public consultation, and there is a legislative milestone for ministers to report on their final decisions in December this year. So that deadline has meant that our deadline in May is as far as we could shift in terms of making recommendations. Another input to this, to government decision making, will be the Climate Change Commission review of Waka Kanoa progress, and that includes a Climate Change Commission assessment of farmer readiness. The Climate Change Commission are also providing advice to government on assistance, or what we call in this in our program we've termed it rebates. Then you'll see there are some, in order to get to emissions pricing in 2025, there are a couple of other steps. Pilot in 2023, mandatory reporting of emissions in 2024, and then emissions pricing in 2025. In developing our options, the He Waka Eke Noa program and partners have agreed a set of objectives. And we have analysed options that we've considered against these objectives, and there are trade-offs against these objectives. No single option can hit on all these objectives equally well. So the key objectives that the program has agreed is that it needs to be effective, and bundled into effective, you've got, it has to reduce emissions, increase sequestration, and maintain a productive, competitive agriculture sector. It has to be practical, it has to be able to be implemented. That means it needs to be simple, and it needs to minimise administration costs. It has to be credible, based on science, and this is particularly important for emissions calculation and sequestration calculations. It needs to be integrated, so we know that's important for farmers, that it aligns with things that they're already managing on farm. So that includes both industry objectives and government objectives, and things like freshwater farm planning, biodiversity, etc. And it needs to be equitable. And this is one that the partnership has grappled with, because everyone has a different idea of what's fair. So what we have done in trying to define what is equitable is we have analysed the impacts of the options, understood where the impacts fall, and then enabled us to make decisions on the basis of knowing who is impacted the most through the policies. And another important part of equitable is allowing that time to transition over time. So as you'll be aware, we are seeking feedback on 2 He Waka Eke Noa options as an alternative to the NZETS backstop. A key point here is that there is no do-nothing option. If He Waka Eke Noa does not recommend a credible alternative to the emissions trading scheme, then that is the option that government will choose. We have developed 2 options, as you'll see there, farm level split gas levy and a processor level hybrid levy. Both those options have some sequestration proposals that Erica will step through. What I'm going to step through now is for each of the options, including the backstop. I'll briefly run through the backstop of the NZETS as a comparison. I'm going to step through who pays, how emissions are calculated, how the price is set. Then Erica will talk about the sequestration aspects. I'll talk briefly about how the revenue raised from any levy or ETS would be used, and a summary of the advantages and disadvantages. And Andrew will go more into the advantages and disadvantages from particularly from a reporting and administration perspective. So just briefly on the NZETS. Under the backstop option, processors and fertiliser manufacturers and importers are responsible for reporting and paying for emissions. The charge is applied to product and is a multiplier of product by a national emissions factor, which is the emissions intensity of that product. On fertiliser, it is an emissions factor applied to each tonne of fertiliser sold. 5% of emissions would be priced. That is, the ag sector gets a 95% free allocation, and that is set in legislation to ramp down at 1 percentage point per year. Under the NZETS, all gases are treated the same, i.e. nitrous oxide, CO2 from urea and methane would all be priced at the same rate per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. The government has signalled that it would recycle or hypothecate any revenue that comes from agricultural being in the emissions trading scheme back into the agriculture sector to support further emission reductions. The specifics of that aren't set in stone, but there is the intention there, and that could include aspects of the sequestration proposals as well, they've indicated. The key advantage to the NZETS is it's got low administration costs. It's an existing system which processors are already reporting in, and as government has indicated, you could use the revenue to support the sector. A key disadvantage is that a processor level price signal is blunt, and the modelling shows that that price signal on its own achieves very little by way of emission reductions at that 95 or 90% free allocation. And it doesn't recognise the individual farm footprints. It also doesn't treat nitrous oxide and methane differently, so it doesn't reflect those different characteristics and the different targets that we have for those gases. So now I'm going to step into the He Waka eke noa options. We did consider a much larger range of options. So what you're seeing is a narrow set of options, so 2 options. And then there are options within the options. You're seeing a narrowed set of options as we've gone through and considered how the different options fit against our criteria. For example, before agreeing on a levy approach, we looked at options like cap and trade, split gas cap and trade, quota, etc. And ultimately, a levy approach was agreed because it is the most simple and practical to implement. There are some things that are common to both this farm level split gas levy and the processor hybrid levy, and that is around the split gas approach to calculating emissions and setting the levy rates. Under this approach, the price of methane would be by kg of methane, so weight of gas, and the price itself would be a unique rate. And again, that's reflecting the fact that methane is a short-lived gas and doesn't need to get to zero. It has a different target than the long-lived gases. It's proposed that the price of long-lived gases, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide from urea, would be a discounted rate of the NZ carbon price. So that recognises the fact that they are a long-lived gas, like other long-lived gases that are covered by the ETS carbon price, but that in order to manage the impacts of that price on the viability of the agriculture sector, it needs to be discounted and phased in over time. In terms of and that would be in carbon dioxide equivalents. The price of sequestration would also be carbon dioxide equivalents, but the price is to be confirmed, and we're still doing some further analysis on this, looking at how we can balance incentives to both recognise and reward sequestration and reduce emissions, and within the context of a self-sustaining affordable system. And you'll see in the consultation document, we have shown the impacts of where the price of sequestration is the equivalent of the NZ ETS carbon price. So how would these prices be set? We are recommending a process for setting and updating the levy and discount rates, and that would involve input from some sort of advisory body with appropriate expertise and representation. And it could be similar to He Waka eke noa in terms of that representation. We've also set factors to consider when setting levy rates and discount rates, and those factors include trajectory towards emissions targets, social and cultural impacts, the cost and availability of new technology, and emissions in production moving offshore, so emissions leakage. So now I'm just going to step through some of the key features of the farm level split gas levy. In terms of which farms would be eligible under this levy or required to participate in the levy, it is all farms that are GSD registered and have over, and I won't read those out, but you'll see a certain number of stock units, cattle, swine, etc., or apply 40 tonnes of nitrogen synthetic fertiliser each year. We've gone for this approach over an area-based approach because it's seen as more equitable. An area-based approach means you have some farms that are very low emitters being captured and some farms that are high emitters not being captured. This farm definition is around the equivalent of 200 tonnes. It covers around 96% of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and about 23,000 farms. The remaining 4% of emissions are made up by another 23,000 farms. This definition includes fertiliser emissions, so under a farm level levy, fertiliser emissions would be included at the farm level, and farms can report and pay as collectives. We've broadly defined collectives, and it could be a processor, catchment group, but they would need to have some sort of legal agreement to participate. There is a choice. We have not made a recommendation yet on who would be responsible. The two options are landowner or business owner. There are pros and cons to both, and Andrew might want to go into a little bit more detail on that. In terms of how emissions would be calculated, they are calculated at the farm level using farm-specific data. There is a single transparent calculation engine, and for those of you who are aware of the approach that we've taken in terms of those awareness raising milestones around Know Your Number, we've said there are a range of tools on the market. Use whatever tool you're already using or have access to build your awareness over a number. Now that's good for awareness, but it doesn't work for emissions pricing because you can't have the variation in the output. So we're recommending a single transparent calculation engine, but there would be an option for simple or detailed reporting within that. Simple's got around 4 inputs, detail's got around 10 or 11, and you're gaining accuracy as you get more detailed. Another key feature of the farm level levy is that the eligible sequestration that Erica will step you through offsets the cost of the emissions levy. And so you'll see in that consultation document, we've got this calculation where A is the weight of methane times the price, B is the weight of long-lived gases times the long-lived gas price, minus C, which is the eligible sequestration times the sequestration price, equals your final liability. The revenue raised from that levy will be reinvested back into the sector, into primarily research and development to accelerate those technologies that are in the pipeline and that will be necessary to ensure that the ag sector can meet its targets at least cost. But it's also really important to note that the recycled revenue funds are also used to enhance the incentive to reduce emissions. So a price on its own needs an additional incentive to make it most effective at least cost to the sector. And so that would be through additional payments or credit for the adoption of approved practices or uses of technologies. And I'll talk a little bit about EMCs shortly, and it's similar to an actions-based EMC. So the key advantages of this farm level levy is you've got your split gas approach, treating the gases differently. You've got your individual farm footprint being calculated, so you're recognising your on-farm efficiencies and any uptake of mitigations. It can recognise sequestration on farms, and that includes early action because of the sequestration that we're counting, which includes existing vegetation. And the revenue raised is reinvested back into the sector to create an additional incentive to reduce and also to bring forward those mitigation technologies. The key disadvantage with this farm level levy, and we've gone through and done some detailed admin costs that we are continuing to refine, but it does have significant admin costs, and I'll let Andrew go into more detail, but it was that result that led us to think, do we need to look at an option which is more cost effective in the short run while there are limited mitigations available, which led us to option 2, the He Waka i Kanoa processor level hybrid levy. So just very quickly on the key features of this option. Similarly to the pricing emissions at the processor level through the ETS backstop, it would be the processors and the fertiliser manufacturers and importers that would report and pay for the emissions, and the emissions charge again would be applied to products. So that's product per kg of product times the emission factor. The key difference for this to the backstop is that split gas approach, different levy rates applied to short-lived and long-lived gases. The other key difference is that revenue to the backstop is that revenue raised would be reinvested back into the ag sector through R&D and through incentives to uptake technology or reward on-farm action to reduce emissions. And this is through what we've called emissions management contracts. So a farmer would apply for a contract, either an actions-based contract or a benchmark contract, demonstrate the emission reductions that are occurring on farm and get a payment back as a result of that, which would indirectly offset the costs of the producer levy. Sequestration management contracts would be the way that eligible sequestration would be recognised and rewarded. And Erica will, as I've said, outline what that sequestration would actually be. Sequestration management contracts would be with the landowner, and they would be tied to the title, recognising the importance of permanence in those contracts. The key advantages of the hybrid approach is that it's the split gas approach again. The admin costs are medium, so they are less than the farm level levy. You have less participants, only those volunteering into the EMC are interacting with that EMC system. However, individual contracts with farmers do come at a cost, and so it's not a low cost option. I guess the key thing, and what the emissions management contracts do is they reward individual farm action, which isn't done through the processor price on its own. Another key factor of a processor levy, hybrid levy, is that it could be a transitional step towards a farm level pricing system. So you'll see in the consultation document, we've talked about what that transition could look like, that it could be ideal to have a date set to ensure that it does shift over time and that a work program is built up that enables that shift. And there are some key indicators that you could build on, such as how many farmers are participating in that EMC system, which is showing a use of farm level emissions calculations and the like. The disadvantage of the processor hybrid levy is that you've still got that processor price itself, which is blunt. It is mitigated by that emissions management contract approach. The emissions management contract with the use of a benchmark could disadvantage those who have taken action prior to that benchmark to reduce. Just a quick summary of the modelling results from these two options. Firstly, we've done some modelling around where existing policies would get us. And that modelling shows that by 2030, you would have a 4.4. I've just focused on methane here because obviously we've got a methane target of 10% reduction below 2017 by 2030. So this slide just focuses on methane, but you will see broader results in both our consultation document and our modelling report. So we're looking at a 4.4% reduction in agricultural methane from 2017 levels from existing policy, and those existing policies are freshwater policy and pricing and ETS forestry. So a shift in land use towards forestry. We also have picked up from the Climate Change Commission advice that the waste sector will also be contributing towards that 10% methane target, and the most conservative estimates of their contribution is around 1.7%. So then on top of that, you're looking at the gap that these policy options need to fill if these policy options are going to be able to support emission reductions in line with the targets, is around about that 4.5% or 4%. So the farm level levy with recycled revenue into additional payments for tech uptake, under the prices that we modelled, we're seeing around a 4.3% reduction in methane emissions, and under our high-tech scenario, where we've brought forward some of the mitigations that are in the pipeline as a result of that investment. And that comes at around a 6% average impact on livestock farm profit. Hybrid levy, very similar, so around 4% reduction in methane emissions and around a 5% reduction in farm profit. So I am now going to hand over to Erica, who is going to step you through the sequestration aspects.
Just before Erica starts, so just on the Q&A, so there's some question and answers coming through now, so, or questions coming through now, so thank you. Kate is answering those questions if we can, so have a look at the answered questions, because Kate has already answered about 3 questions, so just monitor that, everyone, and then the questions that Kate can't answer that are more relevant for the panel to answer, we'll come back to at the end. So over to you, Erica.
Thanks, Gus, and kia ora koutou. So next slide, please, Kenny. In terms of the sequestration design elements, a key concept that we needed to use was additionality. This is an important concept to ensure environmental integrity, and basically that any sequestration we're rewarding is actually genuine sequestration and helping us achieve what we're trying to achieve. So additionality is basically that the sequestration that is rewarded is above business as usual. It's an international concept, and it's used widely internationally and also in our domestic systems such as the ETS, and also in the way we do our accounting for greenhouse gases. So there's generally two ways of applying additionality. One is with a baseline year, and you're probably familiar with the pre-post 1990 and the way that the ETS uses that. So we've looked at using a similar approach, albeit with 2008 rather than 1990 at this stage. That's because information from satellite imagery availability in 2008 is a lot better than what it was in 1990, and so on balance we feel like more farmers will be rewarded for the post 2008 rather than 1990. The other way that we've applied additionality is through a management action, and I'll talk about that in a bit more once we get to it. But that effectively enables us to reward older vegetation in a way that hasn't been done before. So I'll just step you through the key elements of the sequestration. I'll go into a bit more detail about the particular categories that we are proposing. What we've done is split vegetation into permanent and cyclical. This effectively means we're rewarding Indigenous vegetation being permanent in a different way to cyclical vegetation, which is primarily where you plant it, it grows, you harvest it, you replant. You harvest it, replant, as opposed to permanent that grows up until it reaches the point of maturity. A key point there is that trees don't grow forever, so they don't keep storing carbon forever. So under our permanent categories, basically most native vegetation types, including regenerating and planted or any mixture of the two, are rewarded just in different ways depending on whether they're post-2007 or pre-2008, and also the ability to reward riparian plantings. Under cyclical, a key point here is that cyclical is rewarded up until the point that it meets the ETS definition. And so for the ETS definition, a forest needs to be greater than a hectare, have the potential to reach 5 metres in height at maturity, greater than 30 metres average width, and there's one, and greater than 30% canopy cover at maturity. So once any cyclical vegetation meets that criteria, even if it's not put into the ETS, it's not eligible for He Waka Eke Noa. But basically, if it's below that and greater than 0.25 hectares, which you can aggregate up small areas to meet that 0.25 hectare definition, we can reward small woodlots, scattered vegetation as long as it's at least 15 stems per hectare, which if you look at a landscape is not actually that many, as well as shelter belts and perennial cropland, so orchards and vineyards. Across all of this, while we've said permanent versus cyclical, another key concept is that we expect permanence. So it is effectively a permanent land use change unless a liability is paid to remove that vegetation. So there are some conditions around that I'll talk about in a second. I'll get into more detail of the accounting method in the next couple of slides. For liabilities, if permanent Indigenous forest is removed, that faces a liability and potentially compliance penalties as well, depending on the nature of that removal. For cyclical, given that some of that will be replanted, then there's 5 years to be able to get it back into vegetation. This allows for period of time to restore vegetation back into that state. There is provision for adverse events. Effectively, there's no liability as long as restorative action's taken, and once that vegetation reaches its former state, then it will start receiving a reward again if that's applicable. We've also got some recognition of recognising that vegetation, particularly Indigenous vegetation, has a broader level of value to the wider community around biodiversity and water quality. We have had to focus on carbon, but where possible, we've been able to reward those wider values. So we have provision for cultural harvest and also a couple of policy levers, such as where exotics are taken out and replaced with natives, there's not a liability faced for the drop in carbon in the short term that occurs there. Great, thanks, Kelly. So just going into a bit more detail on our categories. For the permanent vegetation, we've applied that 2008 year here. So vegetation established before 2008 can only be rewarded with that management action test of additionality. So to get a consistent management action, we've applied stock exclusion to that. That doesn't necessarily need fencing. If there's geographic boundaries that effectively remove stock, that's adequate, but there does need to be stock exclusion there. We've also got provision for what we're calling active ecological management. That's yet to be defined, but effectively, if there's additional action that's been taken to look after the ecology of that vegetation, that's likely to lead to greater carbon sequestration outcomes, and therefore we have the potential to reward that further action at a slightly greater rate. For vegetation established after 1 January 2008, we're doing full carbon stock accounting in a very similar way to how the ETS accounts for that vegetation. And a key point there is farmers could choose between He Waka Eke Noa or the ETS, as long as it met that ETS criteria. So it just accumulates carbon, more and more carbon each year as that vegetation gets older. Using at this stage the lookup tables in the ETS, which I'll note are under review for native vegetation. For riparian, as long as it's established after 1 January 2008, there'll be a reward for that. It needs to be predominantly woody vegetation, predominantly native, and not predominantly weed species to qualify, and at least 1 metre wide. That'll have a national average applied to it that all riparian will be rewarded with. For the permanent categories, there's no area limit for how much vegetation can be recognised. And for cyclical, this, as I said, can be harvested and re-established, but it must be in that harvest and re-established. That includes vegetation that falls over, needs to be replaced, and it must stay in that in perpetuity unless the liability is paid. The other key thing here, as I said, is that it can't, once it meets the ETS definition, we won't reward it. The way this will be rewarded is basically as that cyclical vegetation grows up until the point where it reaches its long-term average carbon stock, it will receive a reward, and then it needs to stay in that perpetual cycle, but it won't keep receiving a reward. So it gets to that long-term average carbon stock, which for pines, for example, is about 16 years. And then just needs to stay in vegetation. So it is a short-term benefit that one. Potentially for some vegetation types, it could be up to 30, 40 years, but that's just something to keep in mind. There'll be different sequestration rates for different vegetation types there. And I think that's all I've got. So just another key point to finish on is that, that this is about rewarding sequestration in an integrated landscape, and that was really critical for the integrity of our sequestration, that it meets that additionality criteria. I'll hand over to Andrew now.
Kia ora, everyone. I'm just going to run through the agricultural emissions reporting system in a little bit more detail this morning. Kelly, next slide, if you would, please. So just a brief overview around the system design. It's very much a co-design process between the different partners, and obviously Māori agribusiness being in there as well. It's very much an agile process, and by this I'm meaning as decisions are made around different parts of the system, whether it be sequestration or relating the price settings or the price mechanism, you very much have to keep revisiting the system itself just to check that everything all still works. So it can very much stretch the grey matter at times. It's quite a fun process to be involved in. The approach has been very much of a whole farm system, looking how this could potentially integrate with other systems out there. Very much had an end user focus. From this, I'm meaning from a farmer perspective, but we've also been looking at it from the administrator perspective, because obviously this has got to be run and it's got to be practical and cost effective from administrator end as well. Obviously cost effective, how can we put this together in terms of emissions reductions at least costs, and talked about potential to integrate with other regulatory and or market systems. So Kelly, next slide. So just going through a bit of a simplified user journey. Obviously there's some fun wire type guide diagrams that go into a lot more detail than this, but this is more of a simple overview. So over the top, we've obviously got a system governance and management at play. What this has really got some key functions. This is in terms of doing the price setting itself, in terms of the revenue generated, looking at how that is recycled and apportioned to whether it be RD&E activities or into the reward systems. Also got a function around the methodology, both for the calculator itself and the reward in terms of keeping that current and onboarding new mitigations and so forth. And then obviously it's got a system oversight function as well. So that bit's critical, that sits over the top. And then in terms of the journey itself, obviously the first part key is around awareness and understanding of the system. That links very much with other parts of the Waka milestones and around greenhouse gas farm plans, but we've also there's other groups looking into capability and outreach and other such things. So there is quite a focus in that area. Then in terms of the system itself, someone would have to register in the system. Some key decisions around this. Kelly's covered off the farm threshold. The other one that was another one that's still being chewed on is the point of responsibilities. This is business owner versus landowner. Unfortunately, when you put sequestration and emissions reductions together, they both really want a different point of responsibility. Sequestration naturally sits with the land. It makes more sense to have a landowner type approach to that. Whereas from an emissions reductions perspective, it makes much more sense to align that with the business owner, because they're responsible for the day-to-day decision making on farm, or that annual decision making process. So that one's being worked through at the moment as to where that would actually land. The other one that's a big challenge in that area to try and work through is lease land, and that, I mean, those of you that have been involved in council processes, that one creates a headache for everyone. So it's an interesting one to work through. And obviously collectives have been enabled, and just to stress, collectives are really essential from the Māori agribusiness perspective. They very much see that they have to be in the system. In terms of the calculation, like Kelly said, it's a single calculation engine, and the reason for this was we did look at multiple tools, but it was decided that that would just be a nightmare to manage in terms of trying to make sure they're all consistent. And if you didn't sort of manage that properly, you could end up with gaming going on with people using one engine over another because it sort of favoured them. So it really was decided in the end it had to be one approach. Having said that, there is a concept around being able to, the existing tools being able to link in to the central engine. So a bit like, example of this would be how Zero or MyOb links to the IRD system. So you could run a similar type of approach. So you could still use your FarmIQ or your FarmX or your Overseer, but behind the scenes, it would just be using the central calculation. So that's one way that we were looking at doing that. In terms of the methods in this, there's two that have been looked at. One's a sort of intermediate stroke simple one, and one's a detail. The simple one is quite simple. It's really just area, stock class over the year, annualized on that one, and then production, nitrogen, fertilizer, and slope, and that gives you a reasonably accurate just simple, easy way of doing things with limited data. It's much more accurate than the ETS output-based approach and allows for a lot more mitigations and so forth to be accounted for. And then there's also a detailed method, which is effectively a much more detailed determination of the energy requirements and the associated dry matter requirements with this, and using a lot more inputs on the farm. If you're interested in the methods, I suggest you go to, there's an ag research report that's on them all, and that one covers off all the components in quite a lot of detail. Next part of the journey is obviously reporting and payment. Yeah, look, where we've landed with that is around an annual reporting system, but we will implement a flexible year-end date. So the concept was if we could align with someone's annual accounts, that would be the most useful, because you can use the stock reconciliations in the annual accounts to very much inform the inputs for the price calculation. So annual, but flexible balance date, so we can align with people's annual accounts. In terms of audit, yes, there is a audit function to the system. And where we're going with that one is very much like it to be a remote desktop audit, because there's a number of these things that could potentially be done in that way. However, with a farm audit as well, if it's required on a as and when basis, but also looking at options to align that with existing audit systems, potentially freshwater farm plans, but obviously we've got industry assurance programs that are out on farm typically every year, so there's potential to align with that. And then there's obviously a review focus, which then links to the system governance and management in terms of price settings and the methods and the fund recycling. So that's just and the one thing I should say as well is the farm level system also has the ability to put some additional incentives into the system to reward some of the technologies to try and better incentivize them. Next slide, please, Kelly. In terms of impacts and insights, obviously it's the farm level system is going to more accurately reflect a farm's emissions, and it's going to sort of be able to directly recognize emissions efficient farms. In terms of the impacts on the different farm systems itself, it just should be noted that the farm level system results in a much higher price faced from the breeding and trading farms, and that's generally because when you look at the processor method, the output-based method, you're only paying on what goes to the processor, whereas the farm level, you're accounting for all your emissions on farm. So therefore, quite logically, the breeding and trading farms end up accounting for all their livestock, as opposed to in the processor system, they'll only be paying for those that are going to the works. Look, it's got an additional incentives used to encourage emissions. That's actually quite key to all the systems. If we want to achieve the emissions reductions, we do need these additional incentive payments. And like Kelly says, this has got the highest administration cost. And administration costs have been broken down into establishment, the farmers, and the administrator side of things. The establishment cost, there's potential to rationalise some of these. We're working through that at the moment. I mean, the reality is it is quite expensive to put together a system that can manage 23,000 odd people. But we are looking at things like, could you piggyback the sequestration part of things into the forestry ETS? I'm not saying being in the ETS, I'm saying just utilise the systems there, so that would save in terms of a cost. So yeah, that one's quite key. And we've also been then looking at, from a farmer and administrator perspective, any other ways that we can reduce the cost. But the reality is, with 23,000 people, there is a set cost there. Next slide. So in terms of the processor hybrid, I'll just highlight the key differences here. The main difference is obviously you're paying up front based on a processor-based level, so an output methodology that I've talked about previously. So everybody pays that one up front. And then what you've got in this system, which is really driving the reductions, is these things called emissions management contracts. So what these are is effectively an incentive to actually make changes on the farm, and there may be multipliers associated with that to drive certain actions or activities. Looking at two approaches to this at the moment, in terms of, can we get away with just straight actions, or do we need a full farm benchmark? There's pros and cons for both, and we're just working through those at the moment as to which one is the best approach. Actions is preferable because it's cheaper to run, but benchmark obviously gives you full flexibility to recognise the on-farm efficiencies and so forth. But otherwise, everything else with the processor hybrid is largely the same. The key difference being you're probably going to deal with half or so the people around the contracts that you would with everybody in a full farm system. So it obviously, from an admin perspective, is cheaper to run. Next slide. Yeah, and then in terms of its impacts and insights, I've sort of covered the method thing already, covered off the breeding and trading farms. It is a cheaper option for them, slightly lower administrative costs, depending on where you go around an actions versus benchmark type approach. Last slide. And then the other option we've been exploring is obviously the transition approach. So there's obviously some key drivers for this. The first one is, at the present moment in time, there's limited mitigations available. So even though the farm level system better recognises your actual emissions, there is a limited room for people to move at the present moment because there are limited options available for them. The other driver would be being able to, if there's a high cost with the farm level system, and it might be better to put some of that money initially into more R&D and actually generate some mitigations as opposed to spending it all on administration costs. And there's another key consideration, which is around the time to set up a fully functional farm system, which is user friendly, and 18 months to 2 years, it could be a little bit challenging or tight in that. It would be much better to have a bit more time around that one. And other considerations around the transition option you need to look at from a cost benefit perspective is how do you ensure you minimize any investments made in the processor hybrid methodology so they don't become stranded assets. Obviously you have to factor that into a cost benefit. Obviously lead-in times for the transition itself to ensure that it's a smooth transitional process as well. So hopefully that's all given you some food to think about, for thought even, and I'll hand it back over to Gus.
That's great. Thank you so much, panelists. And I can see there's some brilliant questions that have come through, which will keep you all busy for the next little while. I think I see that there are a bunch of questions around sequestration, in particular the baseline. So I might pass to Erica, and we'll capture those as a group of questions, and then we'll come back to some of the reporting stuff, Andrew. I'm just running through the questions, sequestration, so we know. So there's the one from Angus McPherson, Erica, on just slightly different to the 2008 baseline. So you might want to cover that one too. So for everyone, for the benefit, that's the ETS for forestry was set up to be voluntary for post-89 forest owners under Waka Ikanoa. If a farmer has more than 1 hectare of ETS eligible exotic forest, then they don't have the option of registering it with Waka Ikanoa, but have to register it with the ETS if they want to have the sequestration recognised. As the ETS has significant long-term implications for participants, shouldn't the landowner have the option to register either in Waka Ikanoa or the ETS? And then there's the baseline question from Angus. And I think that, and then the plant and research. MFE has calculated a land use and carbon analysis for 1991. I used that instead of the 2008 deadline. So over to you, Erica, thank you.
Thanks, Angus, for a good question. So I guess that was our idea, was that that all sequestration could go in either system, and that we wouldn't have to worry too much about overlap. The reality is the ETS does exist, and there's significant administrative complexity of having a lot of overlap within those systems. The other key constraint that we had is if there was overlap, we were constrained by the methodology used in the ETS in terms of how we did that for our accounting. So that's why we made the decision to separate, and the ETS exists. There is a pathway for landowners to be rewarded in the ETS for that cyclical vegetation, and it enabled us to have different accounting methodologies and focus on what we're trying to achieve within He Waka Eke Noa. The other thing I was just going to say around, I'm sorry, it's always good when Gus throws you about 20,000 things to think about at the same time.
Sorry.
Also, your point around the significant long-term implications for participants in the ETS, that also applies to He Waka Eke Noa. So just to be really clear, that same long-term liability exists under both systems. So we can't avoid that. He Waka Eke Noa is not really an easier run from the perspective of those long-term decisions. So that's the other point I wanted to make there. With regards to 2008 as the baseline, we effectively had two options, as many of you have pointed out in the questions, 1990 or a more recent year. We were hearing from a lot of farmers that they've had significant challenges in getting their into the ETS, where it was where the aerial imagery was showing up things like rocks, and on the balance of probability, it was denied entry into the ETS. So we weighted up hard. We went with 2008 because farmers, any one of us, can jump on online now, and we can look at aerial imagery from 2008, and we know what the vegetation state was at that time. You can't do the same for 1990 baseline. Now, we understand that there's winners and losers. So basically, if you've established vegetation between 1990 and 2008, you're potentially out of luck, and possibly that applies into both systems. So I would encourage you, if you have strong thoughts about that, to provide that to us in the feedback. All of these recommendations are proposed, and that is the point of this period now, is to get feedback and potentially, none of this is locked in. So that's a key point there. We know, I talked to a farmer the other day who between 1990 and 2008 has planted 30,000 trees, which was obviously pretty soul destroying for them. Equally, if we went to 1990, there'd be farmers that would miss out as well. And we would need to have some form of probably centralised system to be able to do the proof of pre-post 1990 as exists in the ETS. So there would be a cost associated with that.
Thanks, Erica. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, just chuck them in the Q&A, and to the extent possible, we'll try and capture them in the time we have available. So there's a question from Simon Love, which is, what's the incentive to use the detailed calculation method over the simple one? So Andrew, I might ask you to answer that one.
The incentive would be to better recognise a wider range of mitigations on farm, because as it goes much more into in a lot more detail the energy requirements and associated the energy use and the associated dry matter requirements, what it does is it digs much more down into various factors, like sort of what crops you're actually grazing for how long, looks in much more detail at the stock classes and where they are around the farm. So what the advantage is it allows you to better reflect your actual emissions number. Works well, yeah, I mean, some of the more intensive systems, it will be key to helping them make emissions reductions. For some of the more extensive ones, it may not create too much of an advantage. So, but really, it's just there from a mitigations perspective.
Thank you, Andrew. If any of the rest of the team have any follow-on points that they want to make, just let me know. This question from Andrew Prest. Are you forecasting also any methane reductions by 2030 due to market supply and demand? These are non-policy changes in consumer purchase intent away from high GHG products towards lower GHG products. So, Kelly, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, sure. So an important point that is recognised across the partnership is that a price is just part of a broader framework to create an incentive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We aren't able to model what you've said, so our modelling focuses in on what change a price on emissions would drive in terms of just an economically rational response to a price. So we haven't modelled that, but we are very clear, and we do highlight that in our engagement document, that a price is one part of that broader framework, which includes market supply and demand. It includes extension support, through farm environment plans and the like.
Thank you, Kelly. So next question, Ray Mohan has asked, how will the processor hybrid levy work for finishing farms that have brought in from store? Will there be a proportion paid by the breeding farm to cover emissions during the first part of the livestock's growth pre-store? Really good question, Ray, and something that has exercised thinking along the way. So Andrew, did you want to have a go at that one?
How the system works is it's a price-based system. So the person who finishes and provides the livestock unit to the processor obviously pays. However, the concept is that price will trickle down through the system. That's if you believe in theory or not, and that's what Gus was referring to. So, yeah, in theory, because they've paid that they're getting less of a reward from the processor because they're paying the processor levy. In theory, they're going to be prepared to pay less, and so therefore it would trickle down through the system. Is the theory, but obviously we all know there's various other things like supply and demand and droughts and all sorts of other things that come into the mix. So there's generally a debate around that one and how that would work. But no, there's no concept of then at the present moment in time having anything like a passport where you would pass the cost on, if you see what I mean. So that's not part of the mix. Could be in the future though.
Thanks, Andrew. Next one's for you too, actually. Who will be the body to register with Waka Kanoa? So is it MFE, is it MPI, etc.? Thanks.
The answer to that one is it's unknown at the present moment in time. Obviously, MPI is just working through what it actually looks like, and then a decision will be made as to where it will sit. Could sit with MPI, could sit with the EPA, could sit with MFE. Might be something that's sort of a bit like Biosecurity New Zealand or something along those lines that sort of sits out to the side as well, but decision yet to be made.
Cool, thank you, Andrew. Next question for you, Erica. Will there be possible future recognition of soil sea sequestration?
Thank you. Potentially. So we have an onboarding process that allows for additional sources of sequestration to be recognised if they meet the criteria and that the science suggests that is an acceptable thing to do. And soil carbon is definitely near the top of that list, as are things like wetlands. Sorry, my computer's just chortling at me, which is very distracting. So wetlands, tussock grasslands, and soil carbon are all have all been identified as kind of early things to consider in part of that onboarding process. Just to point out also that onboarding process doesn't just apply for sequestration, but across the whole system. So that's how recognition of new mitigation technologies for methane reduction, for example, would be assessed, as well as different technologies that might enable us to be more accurate in our accounting. So we know that there's some technological advances for carbon sequestration, accounting from from satellite imagery, for example. So aware of all of that. Soil carbon, there's a bunch of work going on, as I'm sure you're aware. At this stage, there hasn't been enough evidence for us to look at including it, but definitely keeping a strong watching brief on how the science progresses and our understanding of that. The Greenhouse Gas Centre have a long-term project looking at that at the moment, so I encourage you to jump on the Ag Matters website and have a look at how that project progresses, and there's some really good information about where that's at the moment.
Awesome, thanks, Erica.
I would also just add, Gus, just point people to the report that we had done by Louis Schipper and Paul Mudge that kind of summarises the state of the soil carbon science at the moment and what would need to happen in order for it to be recognised in a pricing system in the future.
Great, Kelly. And is that on the Waka Ikanoa website?
Yeah, if you go to Your Say and then go down to our technical reports, you'll see it there.
Excellent, thanks very much. A question for you, Andrew. Would there be a verification process for the emissions management contract and the sequestration management contract calculations?
Yep, there'd definitely be a verification process. Concept is very much, can we keep it desktop based? So in order to get your reward payment, you'd be providing evidence that you'd undertaken the actions or you had the sequestration or whatever it may be on your farm. So yes, very much so. And it also has the potential to, someone to go out on farm and audit as well if things weren't quite right. So.
Thank you. And a follow-on question relating to audit. What would the audit component of a processor levy look like?
I was going to say that's still being worked through, Simon, so I'm sure that you would love to help us with that. I'm noticing all Simon's questions are audit related. So.
Sounds like you're going to get a call and an email, Simon. Cool, thank you. And a question from John Palmer. What is the approved calculation engine? So is that for you, Andrew?
I think so. I mean, the approved calculation engine hopefully did cover that a little bit in the presentation, but it's yet to be decided what it is, but it will be just a standard engine owned by whomever is the implementation agency. So.
And if I just jump in and just flag a key word there is that it would need to be transparent. So that's an important principle as part of the calculation engine.
Cool. To give Andrew a break, we might just skip a question. So another one from Simon. So if there's a single calculation engine, and maybe this is a question for you, Kelly, but Andrew can answer it. Would existing certifications, e.g. Toito Carbon Zero, be given recognition, or would Carbon Zero certified farms also need to complete the Waka Ikanoa calculator?
So there's a couple of things kind of packed into that question. The first thing, I mean, Toito uses Overseer. So the first point is, as Andrew's mentioned, we are exploring the idea that there is interoperability between existing calculators and the central calculation engine. So that is something that could take place there. But what's important is that the methodology is consistent, and it's the methodology that sits in that central calculator. That overlap between, in particular, Toito and other voluntary carbon assurance schemes is also a separate question. And there are rules around voluntary offsetting markets. And one of the important things there is that a farmer wouldn't be able to enter their sequestration in He Waka Ikanoa and then also have it rewarded through a voluntary offsetting scheme. There are very set rules around that, and that would be considered double dipping. So that's also something to be aware of.
Just to add to that, so I guess a key thing for farmers and for you as rural professionals to share with landowners is it is a long-term strategic decision as to what sequestration is rewarded, and there's effectively three options. There's ETS, there's He Waka Ikanoa, and there's the voluntary carbon market. And so those three things are going to need to be weighed up, just like you would weigh up any long-term policy decisions that you'd make in your farming business. So, and there's different rules around all of those, and there's obviously different implications of removing that vegetation and all of those systems, and also implications of overlap. So there's quite a lot of choice that needs to be had there.
While we're on the calculators, why don't we cover Andrew's question on why not use existing accepted global calculators? In-house New Zealand calculators may be criticised by large overseas customers, for example. So, did you want to pick that, Kelly, or Andrew?
I can start. Andrew can jump in. But I do. We have. I know we've talked about this, Andrew. That there are global calculators out there, and as part of our awareness building approach, where we look at calculators and make sure that they meet some baseline requirements in terms of credibility. We're certainly open to doing that with some global calculators. What we have seen with some of the global calculators that are out there, that they aren't really fit for purpose in terms of that New Zealand situation, in particular looking at how those calculators manage fertiliser emissions and the like. But it's certainly not ruled out. I think the key point, and Andrew, this might be where you want to jump in, is just that in an emissions pricing system, we looked at an approach where you could use multiple methods and multiple tools, but on balance, the advantages that come from people having flexibility of using a tool that they're already familiar with does not outweigh the downside of having a variation in numbers, which when you're talking about putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions isn't seen as a credible approach. So while we could certainly use the IP and that's something that hasn't been ruled out, that goes into existing calculators, it's that transparent central calculator engine, which is a core principle. Is there anything you'd add there, Andrew?
The only thing I'd also add as well is the focus here is around something that's going to be able to be used to help us towards our emissions targets, the national emissions targets. So we're going to need something that's consistent with the methodologies that are used in New Zealand, and it's how do some of those overseas tools align with that? And look, we very much are aware here there's some tensions here between the market side of things and the tools you use for that versus the national accounting and reaching domestic targets. But at the end of the day, it does make most sense to have something which is centrally controlled, but also, like Kelly says, is transparent. So
cool, thank you both. Why don't we cover the last question on calculators, at least and now, and then we can move on. So Warren's asked, and I think this was covered in the presentation, but rather than wait for a calculator to be built, why not allow farmers to calculate individually their emissions using existing tools? So that's exactly what we're doing, Warren. And as you say, this potentially drives the correct behaviours and efficiencies that the processor hybrid will do if there was a transitional step. So that is part of the program. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kelly. Andrew, have anything to add on that?
Yeah, it's certainly part of the awareness building program, and the reason why it's not then flowing into the pricing mechanisms themselves, including that processor hybrid, is what we've outlined there. Warren, but happy to talk more about that directly if you like. Oh, Erica, you're going to jump in.
I was just going to say, in terms of supporting landowners with that, I've been saying to clients, look, the actual number that it spits out is not the important thing. The importance of understanding your number is actually having an understanding of what drives the number. So if over time you're using a consistent tool to do that and able to understand what's driving the number, that's going to help with on-farm decisions around the long-term implications of any policies that are going to come your way. So while your number might be different, and appreciate that there's obviously significant financial implications of what the number will be, at this stage, as Kelly and Andrew have pointed out, it's around understanding what drives that number so that that supports action to be able to potentially mitigate that cost once that's applied.
Thank you, Erica. I might we'll go to Steve McGill's really crunchy question, which is a really good one, and I'll pass it over to you, Kelly. But in order to drive in order to change on-farm behaviour and reduce emissions at the farm level, then why is Waka Kanoa recommending a processor level option?
Yeah, it is a good question, Steve. And certainly as a program, we started with a focus on that farm level option, and that was the original proposal. It was in developing that option that we were presented with that, the hard reality of the administrative costs associated with it, both for the administrator but also for farmers. And it was that cost benefit analysis when there are limited mitigations available at the moment that made us think, do we need to look at an option that has lower admin costs and could be a transition over time, hence having a processor option on the table as well. I'll stress that both those options are still on the table. They're both on the table, and what we are seeking through our feedback form is feedback on people's preferences for either a farm level option, a processor hybrid option, or the processor hybrid being a transition to a farm level.
Thanks, Kelly. This is a bit of a follow-on question to that, actually. So James Cooperis has asked, has the Minister reviewed the two options being consulted on, and is he satisfied that they'll meet his requirements, i.e. if Waka Kanoa puts forward a preferred model, is it possible it may not be acceptable to the Minister?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and that's been a really interesting aspect of this partnership, and what made it quite unique is that we have the Ministries for Primary Industries and the Ministries for Environment involved in the partnership and involved in the collaborative design, and that was deliberate because the partnership wanted to be able to recommend something that would land. That said, ministers still have ultimate decision-making power, and that falls with Cabinet. And so government officials have been providing a dual role in this partnership. They've been providing advice on what they think would land, and they will also advise ministers on what they think is the best way forward. So there is certainly potential that ministers don't accept the Waka Kanoa recommendations, but everyone has been operating in good faith, and you'll see that the options themselves already present I guess a lot of middle ground in terms of where the sector started and where government started and where we've been able to come together. So that is embedded in the options. But that said, the decision still sits with ministers. They will be doing broader consultation with the general public, which they will also be taking into account when making their final decisions.
Cool, thanks, Kelly. There's a question from Alistair Rutherford. Andrew, perhaps this is yours. Have you evaluated the synergies and potential?
We've had a go at that. So the update to the greenhouse gas farm plan guidance, you'll see in that one does cover off where there's some synergies in terms of the actions to be undertaken. We've also been looking at it from the systems and processes side of things, noting that obviously freshwater farm plans, it's not been landed on yet how they will operate and what's involved and so forth. So, we're just making some assumptions around that. So, yeah, very much have been doing that. Generally, there's alignment, but there are some areas where there could be some differences, and one of those is obviously in the point of responsibility, the business owner versus landowner, which is yet to be 100% landed, but noting freshwater farm plans are with the business operator. So.
Thanks, Andrew. A clarification question for you too. Are hort and arable now only included if they're above the 40 kilograms per hectare fertiliser threshold?
Yes, or they have more than the various stock units or different stock types on their farm, but that's just for the farm level system. Obviously, for the processor hybrid system, everybody would be paying the levy because the levy would be applied to your fertiliser. So it'll be collected not only by the processor, we should have made that clearer, it's also the fertiliser manufacturers and suppliers as well that pay the levy.
Great, thank you. A couple of follow-on questions regarding sequestration, Erica. So one from Megan. If you have evidence, photos, records that you planted between 1990 and 2008, will you be able to register it in Waka Kanoa? So maybe answer that one. I won't throw you a number. So answer that one and we'll go to the next one.
Thanks. So thanks, Megan. At this stage, no. But again, that's something that we could look at. As has been said a number of times, we've had to balance between the complexity of a system versus the administrative cost of what that means, as well as having something workable. So at this stage, that would add another layer of complexity that we haven't gone to, but that could still be an option that's considered. So and I think John Palmer raised a similar point. So so definitely worth plugging that into the feedback as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And Angus has a follow-on question around the liabilities. So under the ETS, participation is registered against the land title, and the NZUs earned by the participant effectively become a contingent liability that increases over time, especially if they've been sold. Under Waka Eke-Noa, are you proposing a similar approach for recorded sequestration?
Yeah, thanks, Angus. So as Andrew said earlier, the sequestration would have to be with the land title, just because of that permanence and that the liability exists in the future if that vegetation is removed. So effectively, it would become a contingent liability, albeit that it won't necessarily increase over time, depending on where the price ends up. So that's obviously, and that's the same with the ETS, the NZU price hasn't always gone up. Obviously that's the direction of travel at present. So effectively it would be the same in the way that operates, but you're not dealing with NZUs under the sequestration management contract. It would be a rebate that would be returned to the participant after a period of time, and the detail around that's still being worked through. And at the farm level, it would be netted off, the sequestration gain would be netted off each year, and a liability would be paid in the year that it occurs as well. So it's just the potential for that long-term liability that makes that contingent liability exist.
Great, thank you, Erica. Did you want to add anything to that, Kelly? No, good. Last question, I think maybe, unless anyone else has any other questions, so just chuck them in the Q&A, but I might ask Kelly for you to address the modelling question. So Steve's asked, has there been any modelling surrounding incentives for using mitigation and reduction technologies, and how would they be applied?
Yeah, Steve, you can find the detail of that modelling. It's in our pan-sector modelling report, which again is available on your say. If you scroll down, you'll see our technical documents. We'll send the links through after this as well. So that does look at, exactly that. You'll see the assumptions around the mitigation and reduction technologies that have been built into that modelling, and then how they then are played out in terms of people responding to their price incentives to take those up.
Brilliant, thanks, Kelly. Look, there are no open questions, so unless anyone's typing furiously at the moment, why don't we wrap up and look. Thank you for attending. It's been great chatting with you. We hope you found it useful. There is lots of information available on the website, and we will send around those links. Kelly, did you want to say anything to wrap up?
Thank you all for your attending. Thanks for those really great questions. It's been a great session. Thank you for the feedback coming through that question chat. It obviously has been useful for you as well, which I'm pleased. We'll send you an email with some follow-up links.
Great. Have a great day, everyone. See you later.